Saigō Takamori. Born in 1828, dead by 1877. The most beloved samurai in all of Japanese history, and the man who raised an army against the modern government he had built with his own hands. The West calls him the last samurai. Almost nothing you picture about him is true. This is his story. On the morning of September the 24th, 1877, a wounded giant of a man sat on a hillside above Kagoshima and waited to die. Below him, 30,000 soldiers of the imperial army surrounded a few hundred ragged samurai. The man on the hill had once commanded that very army. Now it had come to kill him. His name was Saigō Takamori, and he is remembered today as a hero. Statues were raised to him. A Hollywood film was made about him. And yet here is the strange truth: no photograph of his face has ever been found, and historians still argue about how he died. The most famous samurai in the world may be the one we know the least. He was born in the warm southern province of Satsuma, in the castle town of Kagoshima, the eldest of 7 children in a family so poor they shared a single quilt between them. Satsuma sat at the far edge of Japan, proud and stubborn, half a world away from the capital. The boys there were raised in neighborhood brotherhoods called Goju, where loyalty was carved into a child before he could read. On the same narrow Kagoshima street lived a thin, sharp-eyed boy named Ōkubo Toshimachi. He and Saigō were almost the same age. They studied together, argued together, and dreamed together of a Japan that could stand against the foreign warships now appearing off the coast. No one watching those two friends could have guessed that one of them would someday give the order to destroy the other. Saigō grew into an enormous man, broad as a temple door, with huge dark eyes and a stillness that made other men lean in to listen. He cared nothing for money or comfort. He gave away his salary, wore plain cotton, and loved 2 things without limit: his dogs, and the idea that a man should be willing to die for what was right. His loyalty nearly killed him long before any rebellion. During a political purge, Saigō and a hunted monk named Gesho threw themselves together into the freezing waters of Kagoshima Bay, choosing death over capture. The monk drowned. Saigō was dragged out alive. He was banished twice after that to remote southern islands, left in damp cells while the country churned on without him, and yet Satsuma always called him back, because he was the one man soldiers would follow into fire. In the 1860s, Saigō and Ōkubo became the twin engines of a revolution. Together they forged the alliance that toppled 700 years of samurai government and restored the young Emperor Meiji to power. Saigō led the armies. Ōkubo worked in the shadows. Between the two of them, they remade a nation. In 1868, Saigō stood at the gates of Edo, the old capital, a city of 1 million people, with an army ready to burn it to the ground. Across the table sat Katsu Kaishu, the negotiator for the fallen shogun. In a single meeting, Saigō agreed to spare the city. Edo surrendered without a fire being lit. That city is the one we now call Tokyo. The samurai had won. But the victory turned bitter in his hands. The new government Saigō had built began dismantling the samurai class itself, banning their swords, cutting their stipends, erasing the only world he had ever known. The men who had died for the restoration were now an embarrassment to it. And Saigō, the soldier of loyalty, no longer knew where his loyalty was supposed to go. In 1873 came the rupture. Saigō pushed for a bold and dangerous mission to Korea, and some believe he meant to die in it, a soldier's death for a man with no more wars to fight. Ōkubo, now the most powerful man in the government, refused. Japan was too fragile, he said. There would be no war. In open council he outmaneuvered his oldest friend and forced him out. Saigō resigned every office he held that same afternoon and went home to Kagoshima. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply left. And 600 officers of the Imperial Guard laid down their posts and followed him south. The friendship of 2 boys from the same street was over. What came after would be settled with rifles. Here the legend and the truth pull apart. The films imagined Saigō as a sword-swinging traditionalist who despised the modern world. He was nothing of the kind. He wore a Western Army uniform. He bought rifles from British dealers. He admired the European armies and built schools to teach their tactics. The man the West calls the last samurai was, in truth, half a modern general. In Kagoshima, Saigō opened private schools for the restless young samurai who had followed him home. Thousands of them drilled with guns and studied the old classics, loyal to no one but him. The government in Tokyo watched this private army with rising fear, and in early 1877 it sent agents to seize Satsuma's gunpowder, and, some believed, to assassinate Saigō himself. The students rose before Saigō could stop them. They stormed the arsenals, and the decision was torn out of his hands. Saigō looked at the boys he had raised, let out a long breath, and gave the only answer his whole life had prepared him for. He would lead them. Not because he believed they could win, but because he could not abandon men who were ready to die for him. His army marched north and broke upon the stone walls of Kumamoto Castle. The garrison, armed with modern guns and led in part by men Saigō himself had trained, held for 50 days. When the imperial reinforcements arrived, the rebellion's spine was broken. From that hour, Saigō was no longer marching toward victory. He was marching home to die. For 7 months they retreated through the mountains of Kyushu, hunted and starving, their numbers thinning with every pass. Saigō burned his uniform and his official papers. He stopped being a general and became once more only a man from Kagoshima, walking back toward the hills where he had been born. In September they reached Shiroyama, the wooded hill that looks down over the city, with perhaps 400 men left against 30,000. They dug caves into the slope and waited. On the last dawn the imperial guns opened fire, and Saigō walked out into the open in a plain robe, and a bullet tore into his hip and groin. What happened next is the most famous death in Japan, and almost certainly a myth. The story says Saigō turned to his friend Beppu Shinsuke, asked him to serve as his second, and opened his belly in the flawless ritual of a samurai. But the wounds in his body tell another tale. Too crippled to lift a blade, he was most likely beheaded by his own men so the enemy could not take him alive. The graceful suicide we remember was written into the history books decades later, when a new Japan needed heroes more than it needed the truth. And then comes the strangest turn of all. When the government wanted a portrait of the rebel they had killed and could not stop loving, they discovered there was no photograph of him anywhere. So in 1883 an Italian engraver named Edoardo Chiasone, who had never once met the man, drew Saigō's face by combining the features of his younger brother and a cousin. That invented face became the statues, the school books, and the film posters. The most recognized samurai on earth wears a face that was never his. 15 years after his death, a bronze statue of Saigō was unveiled in Uyeno Park in Tokyo, showing him in a plain cotton robe, walking his beloved dog. His widow, Itoko, stood in the crowd. When the cloth fell away she cried out that it looked nothing like her husband, that he would never have appeared in public dress so casually. Even his own wife did not recognize the legend the country had built. The government that had hunted him could not bear to leave him a traitor. In 1889, the Emperor Meiji, the very emperor Saigō had risen against, pardoned him and restored his honors. People swore his face had appeared in a red star burning in the night sky, watching over them still. The rebel had become a god. And Ōkubo Toshimichi, the friend who had destroyed him, was cut down by assassins in a Tokyo street the year after Saigō died, blamed by many for the blood of a hero. Saigō Takamori spent his entire life being loyal, to his lord, to his friend, to his emperor, to his students, and every loyalty in the end demanded that he betray another. He could not save them all, so he chose the men standing in front of him, and walked with open eyes toward his own death. We remember him not because he won, but because he refused to abandon the people who needed him, even when staying meant the end of everything he had built. Loyalty, he seems to say across a century and a half, is not measured on the days it costs you nothing. So here is the question his life leaves us. If you had been Ōkubo, and crushing your oldest friend's rebellion was the only way to save the country you had both bled for, could you have given that order? Tell me in the comments. One line is enough. Tales of Old Japan publishes a new story every Sunday, Wednesday, and Saturday. If this one stayed with you, subscribe and read more at the Japan Dispatch, the newsletter that keeps these stories alive. The link is in the description.